Black woman saves Hell's Angel's son from bullies the next day. Dozens of bikers show up at her door. The mild spring breeze carried the distinctive rumble of motorcycles before Ella could even reach the sidewalk. Across the street, a line of gleaming Harley-Davidsons pulled up, their chrome flashing in the morning sun. The riders, all clad in patched leather, dismounted with practiced ease, their presence instantly making the quiet residential street shrink. One man, Trey Walker, separated himself from the group. His tall, imposing frame crossed the street, his weathered face showing years of hard living, yet his eyes held a surprising gentleness. "Mrs. Williams," he said, his voice gravelly but respectful, "I wanted to thank you personally for helping my boy yesterday." Ella, standing her ground, met his gaze. "Please, call me Ella," she replied, her voice steady. "And there's no need for thanks. I just did what anyone should have done." Trey shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. Not everyone would step in to help a Hell's Angels kid. Most people in this town cross the street when they see us coming." The truth of his words hung heavy. Ella glanced at the other bikers, who maintained a respectful distance, their leather vests bearing the same patches Eli wore. "Eli's a good boy," she said firmly. "He shouldn't have to deal with bullies just because of—" She gestured toward the motorcycles. A ghost of a smile crossed Trey's face. "You're right about that." He pulled a small envelope from his pocket. "It's not much, but we wanted to show our appreciation." "Oh, that's really not necessary," Ella protested. "Please," Trey insisted, his voice softening. "It would mean a lot. To me and Eli both." She saw beyond the leather and the patches to a father intent on doing right. With a small nod, she accepted the envelope, tucking it into her cardigan pocket. "Thank you," Trey said, offering a silent nod of respect. He turned and strode back to his waiting machine. The moment the bikers mounted, the engines roared to life in quick succession, the combined sound echoing off the houses like thunder. As they pulled away, Trey raised a hand in a final acknowledgement. Ella stood motionless until the last motorcycle disappeared, the deep vibrations fading away. Her quiet morning walk forgotten, she remained on her front steps, aware that the rigid boundaries of her familiar neighborhood had just been shifted by a single act of direct action and a father's gratitude. The envelope in her pocket seemed to carry the weight of more than just a token of gratitude. It represented a connection to a world she'd never expected to touch her own, and she knew with certainty that her peaceful life had just taken an unexpected turn. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ella's garden as she knelt among her prized rose bushes. Her weathered hands worked methodically, pulling stubborn weeds from the rich soil. The familiar scent of earth and blooming flowers brought her comfort after the morning's unexpected encounter with the Hell's Angels. A shadow fell across her flower bed, and she looked up to find Eli standing awkwardly at the edge of her garden. His shoulders were hunched, hands buried deep in his jeans pockets. The leather vest he wore seemed too heavy for his small frame. "Hi, Mrs. Williams," he said softly, scuffing his shoe against the ground. I wanted to thank you again for yesterday." Ella sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her gardening apron. "That's very kind of you, Eli. Would you like to sit with me for a while?" She gestured to the wooden bench nearby, positioned perfectly in the shade of her old maple tree. Eli nodded and followed her to the bench. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching a pair of cardinals flit between the branches above. "The pie was lovely," Ella said warmly. "Did you help make it?" "No," Eli admitted, a slight blush coloring his cheeks. "Dad got it from the bakery, downtown. He doesn't really cook much." "Is it just you and your father at home?" Ella asked gently. Eli's fingers twisted in his lap. "Yeah, Mom left when I was little. I barely remember her." He paused, then words began tumbling out. "It's hard sometimes. Dad's gone a lot with the club. When he is home, he doesn't really know what to say to me. And at school." His voice trembled. "Nobody wants to be friends with a Hell's Angels kid." Ella's heart ached as she watched him struggle to hold back tears. "That must be very lonely," she said softly. "I don't fit in anywhere," Eli continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The other club kids, they're different. They like all the tough stuff, the bikes, the attitude, but I'm not like that. And regular kids?" He shook his head. "They're scared of me, or their parents won't let them hang out with me, like I'm going to corrupt them or something." "Being caught between two worlds is never easy," Ella said, watching a butterfly land on her roses, "especially when you're trying to figure out who you are. Sometimes I wish—" Eli stopped, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "Sometimes I wish Dad wasn't in the club. But then I feel awful for thinking that. He's still my dad, you know?" Ella nodded, understanding the complexity of his feelings. She noticed how his shoulders had begun to relax, the tension slowly leaving his face as he spoke. "Life isn't always simple, dear," she said, her voice warm and steady. "But you don't have to figure it all out alone. You're welcome here any time you need a quiet place or someone to talk to." Eli looked up at her, hope flickering in his eyes. "Really? You don't mind? Even with everything?" "Even with everything," Ella confirmed firmly. She reached out and patted his hand. "We all need someone in our corner, Eli. And I want you to know that you're not alone. Not anymore." A small smile tugged at the corners of Eli's mouth, the first real smile she'd seen from him. In that moment, sitting in her garden with the afternoon sun warming their shoulders, Ella saw past the leather vest and the family name to the heart of a boy who just needed someone to see him for who he was. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ella's front porch as she settled into her favorite wicker chair, a steaming cup of chamomile tea warming her hands. The gentle spring breeze carried the sweet scent of her blooming gardenias, and she closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the peaceful atmosphere. The familiar sound of footsteps on the sidewalk made her open her eyes. Mr. Granger, one of the town's most notorious gossips, was making his way past her house. He wore his usual pressed khakis and polo shirt, looking every bit the retired banker he was. When he spotted her, he slowed his pace, then stopped altogether. "Afternoon, Ella," he said, his voice carrying a hint of something that made her straighten in her chair. His eyes darted around her property as if searching for evidence of something unseemly. "Hello, Richard," she replied evenly, taking a deliberate sip of her tea. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly bursting to say something. Finally, he couldn't contain himself any longer. "Word around town is you're getting involved with those bikers." He didn't phrase it as a question, but rather as an accusation. Ella set her teacup down on the small table beside her with a soft clink. She met his gaze steadily, her voice calm but firm. "I helped a young boy who was being bullied, Richard. That's all there is to it. But they're Hell's Angels, Ella," he pressed, lowering his voice as if the mere mention of the name might summon them. "You know what they're like, what they do. It's not safe to mix with their kind." A small smile played at the corners of Ella's mouth as she picked up her tea again. "Their kind? You mean people who need help? Because that's all I see when I look at that boy." Mr. Granger's face reddened, slightly. "People are talking, you know. They're saying you're choosing sides." "The only side I'm choosing is kindness, Richard." Ella's voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath her gentle tone. "And if people want to talk about that, let them. I've lived in this town too long to start worrying about gossip now." He opened his mouth to say more, but something in Ella's expression made him think better of it. Instead, he gave a little huff and continued on his way, his back stiff with disapproval. Ella watched him go, shaking her head slightly. The tea in her cup had cooled, but she didn't mind. Her thoughts drifted to Eli, to the way his eyes had lit up when she'd simply shown him basic kindness. If people wanted to judge her for that, so be it. The distinctive rumble of a motorcycle engine filled the air. Ella looked up to see one of the Hells Angels members walking his bike slowly past her house. He was younger than Trey, with a neat beard and the same leather vest covered in patches. As he passed, his eyes met hers, and he gave her a small, respectful nod. The small diner on Main Street buzzed with the usual lunch crowd chatter. Ella sat across from Rachel, her friend of 30 years, in their usual booth by the window. Sunlight streamed through the glass, warming their coffee cups and highlighting the concerned wrinkles on Rachel's face. "I saw Eli leaving your house again yesterday," Rachel said, stirring her coffee with careful precision. Her voice was soft but carried an edge of worry. "That's the third time this week, isn't it?" Ella nodded, taking a bite of her turkey sandwich. "He's been helping me with my garden. That boy has quite the green thumb, you know." Rachel leaned forward, her half-eaten salad forgotten. "Ella, honey, I need to say something, and I hope you'll hear me out." She glanced around the diner before continuing. "Those bikers, they're dangerous people. Everyone knows what they're mixed up in." "Eli isn't dangerous," Ella replied firmly. "He's just a boy who needs someone to talk to. It's not just about Eli." Rachel's fingers drummed nervously on the table. "I've seen those motorcycles parked near your house. People are talking, Ella. They're worried about you." The waitress stopped by to refill their coffee cups, and both women waited until she was out of earshot before continuing their conversation. "Do you remember last year's incident at the gas station?" Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper. "3 men hospitalized. Everyone knew it was the Angels, but nobody dared say a word." Ella set down her cup and met her friend's concerned gaze. "I appreciate your worry, Rachel. I do. But you haven't seen how that boy's eyes light up when someone finally listens to him. You haven't heard the pain in his voice when he talks about school." "But his father," Rachel started. "Is his father—" Ella finished. "And yes, I know who Trey Walker is and what he does. But Eli isn't his father." Rachel reached across the table and squeezed Ella's hand. "I just don't want to see you get hurt. These people, they live by different rules. What happens if something goes wrong?" Ella squeezed back, offering a gentle smile. "Sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks. I can't turn my back on that boy just because I'm afraid of what might happen." They finished their lunch in thoughtful silence, the weight of unspoken concerns hanging between them. When the check came, Rachel insisted on paying, like she always did. "Just promise me you'll be careful," Rachel said as they stood to leave. "You've always had a big heart, Ella. I don't want it to get you into trouble." "I promise," Ella replied, hugging her friend goodbye. "And thank you for caring enough to say something." The afternoon sun was warm as Ella walked home, her sensible shoes clicking against the sidewalk. As she approached O'Malley's bar, she could see them, 5 Hells Angels members lounging on the wooden porch, their leather vests gleaming in the sunlight. The sight would have made her nervous just a week ago. Their conversations quieted as she passed. Instead of the intimidating stares she might have expected, they acknowledged her with respectful nods. One of them even touched his fingers to his forehead in a casual salute. They recognized her now, not as an outsider to be feared, but as someone who had earned their respect. As Ella continued her walk home, she thought about Rachel's warnings. They weren't wrong, exactly, but they weren't the whole truth either. Sometimes, she realized, doing the right thing meant walking a complicated path. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Ella's kitchen window when she heard the distinctive rumble of a motorcycle pulling up to her house. She wiped her hands on her apron and peered outside, surprised to see Trey Walker stepping off his bike, holding what looked like a pie tin. The doorbell rang, and Ella opened it to find the tall biker shifting uncomfortably on her front porch. His leather vest creaked as he held out the pie. "Made it myself," he said gruffly. "Probably not as good as yours, but—" He shrugged, letting the sentence trail off. Ella's face softened into a warm smile. Well, that's mighty thoughtful of you, Trey. Would you like to come in for some coffee? He hesitated for a moment before nodding. Yes, ma'am. That'd be nice. Inside, Ella busied herself with the coffee maker while Trey sat at her small kitchen table, looking almost comically large in the dainty chair. His weathered hands rested on the flowered tablecloth, fingers drumming nervously. Sugar? Ella asked, setting down two steaming mugs. Black's fine, he replied, wrapping his hands around the cup. They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments before Trey spoke again. My boy, he started, then cleared his throat. Eli, he's been different since you helped him. Talks more. Ella nodded encouragingly, sipping her coffee. Truth is, Trey continued, his voice growing rough with emotion, I don't know what I'm doing with him. Never did. His mama left when he was little, and the club, well, it's all I've known. But it ain't no life for a kid. He stared into his coffee cup as if it held answers. Sometimes I look at him, and I see this scared little boy who needs his dad. But I don't know how to be that for him. Never learned how. Ella set her cup down gently. Being a parent isn't something that comes with a manual, Trey. We all make mistakes. My mistakes are bigger than most, he said, a bitter edge to his voice. The things I've done, the life I've led, it ain't right. Bringing him up in all this. But I can't seem to find my way out either. It's never too late, Ella said softly, reaching across the table to pat his hand. Eli needs you, not the club president, not the tough biker, just his father. Start there. Trey's shoulders slumped slightly. What if I mess it up worse? Then you try again, Ella replied firmly. That boy loves you, Trey. He's just waiting for you to show him you love him back. Trey nodded slowly, finishing his coffee in one long swallow. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. Thank you, Mrs. Williams, for everything. Ella, she corrected him with a smile. And you're welcome. She walked him to the door, watching as he pulled on his leather gloves. Before stepping outside, he turned back to her. Never thought I'd be taking parenting advice from a lady who bakes pies, he said, the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Life has a funny way of surprising us, Ella responded. She stood in her doorway as Trey walked to his motorcycle, his broad shoulders straight but somehow lighter than when he'd arrived. As he rode away, Ella watched him disappear down the street, wondering if her words had made any difference at all. A gentle breeze rustled through Ella's flower garden as she heard the familiar shuffle of feet coming up her walkway. Looking up from her porch swing, she saw Eli, his shoulders hunched and hands stuffed deep in his pockets. The afternoon sun caught his dark hair, making him look younger than his years. Hey there, Ella called out warmly, patting the empty space beside her on the swing. Would you like to join me? Eli nodded, climbing the steps slowly. He sat down, the old swing creaking softly under their combined weight. For a while, they just sat there, swaying back and forth in comfortable silence. I saw my dad leaving here yesterday, Eli finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Did he say anything about me? Ella turned to look at him, noting the mix of hope and worry in his eyes. He cares about you very much, Eli. Sometimes parents struggle to show it the right way. Eli picked at a loose thread on his jeans. Everyone in town knows who I am. They see this vest, he tugged at the leather material, and they think they know everything about me, like I'm just some biker's kid. That must be very hard, Ella said softly, her heart aching for the young boy beside her. At school, nobody wants to be my friend. They're either scared of me or they make fun of me. Eli's voice cracked slightly. The teachers look at me different too, like they're just waiting for me to cause trouble. Just because I'm Trey Walker's son. Ella reached over and placed her weathered hand on his arm. Listen to me, Eli. You are so much more than just your father's son. I see a kind, thoughtful young man who's trying his best to find his way." Eli's eyes welled up with tears. "Sometimes I wish I could just be normal. But then I feel bad for thinking that way. Dad's always talking about loyalty and family, but—" He wiped his eyes quickly. "I don't know where I fit in anymore." "You don't have to be just one thing," Ella said, her voice gentle but firm. "You can be proud of your family and still want different things for yourself. That's not being disloyal. That's being honest about who you are." "Really?" Eli looked up at her, hope flickering across his face. "Really?" Ella smiled. "You know, I've noticed how carefully you look at my garden. Do you like drawing or painting?" A small smile tugged at Eli's lips. "Yeah, I sketch sometimes. But Dad says art is—" He trailed off, shrugging. "Art is a wonderful way to express yourself," Ella said. "Maybe next time you visit you could bring your sketchbook?" For the first time since he'd arrived, Eli's face lit up. "You wouldn't mind?" "I'd love to see your work," Ella assured him. They sat together a while longer, the swing moving gently, until Eli stood up. "I should probably head home," he said, looking more relaxed than when he'd arrived. "Thanks, Mrs. Williams, for, you know, everything." "Any time, dear, you're always welcome here." Ella watched as Eli walked down her garden path and onto the sidewalk. His steps were lighter now, his head held a bit higher. As he disappeared around the corner, she couldn't help but wonder how much longer this fragile peace could last. The morning sun filtered through Ella's kitchen window as she stirred honey into her tea. A firm knock at the door interrupted her peaceful routine. Setting down her spoon, she made her way to answer it, surprised to find a well-dressed woman in her early 40s standing on her porch. "Mrs. Williams? I'm Miss Harris from Child Protective Services." The woman held up her badge, her expression professional but stern. "May I come in? I'd like to discuss Eli Walker." Ella's heart skipped a beat, but she maintained her composure. "Of course. Please come in." She led Miss Harris to her living room, where the social worker settled into an armchair, pulling out a notepad. "I understand you've been spending time with Eli recently," Miss Harris began, her pen poised above the paper. "We've received several complaints about possible neglect at home. Would you mind sharing your observations?" Ella clasped her, hands in her lap, choosing her words carefully. "Eli is a wonderful boy. His father, Trey, works hard to provide for him. Mrs. Williams, we have reports of Eli being left alone for extended periods. There are concerns about his father's associations." Miss Harris's lips tightened. "The Hells Angels aren't exactly known for creating stable home environments." "Now wait just a minute." Ella straightened in her chair. "I've seen how Trey cares for his son. Yes, he makes mistakes, but he's trying his best. Eli has food on the table, a roof over his head, and a father who loves him." Miss Harris made a note on her pad. "Love isn't always enough, Mrs. Williams. We need to ensure Eli's safety and well-being. The environment he's growing up in, the criminal elements, the constant exposure to gang activity, processed him. It's concerning. Trey's been making changes," Ella insisted, her voice firm but kind. "I've seen it myself. He's reaching out, trying to be more present in Eli's life." "I appreciate your perspective, Miss," Harris replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "But the fact remains that we're considering removing Eli from his current situation. The evidence of neglect is mounting, and we have to think about what's best for him." The words hit Ella like a physical blow. She thought of Eli's shy smile, his tentative trust, the way he was finally starting to open up. "Please," she said softly, "give them more time. I promise to keep a closer eye on things." Miss Harris studied her for a long moment. Your involvement with Eli has been noted, Mrs. Williams. While I understand you want to help, you should be aware that associating with known criminal elements could affect how your testimony is viewed should this case go to court. Ella sat up straighter, her chin lifting. I'm not concerned about appearances, Miss Harris. I care about what's right for that boy. And separating him from his father right now would do more harm than good. That's not your decision to make. Miss Harris closed her notepad and stood. I'll be conducting further investigations. Please contact our office if you observe anything concerning. After showing Miss Harris out, Ella sank into her favorite chair, her tea long forgotten. The weight of the situation pressed down on her shoulders. Eli needed her now more than ever, and she couldn't let him down. The thought of him being taken away from his father, just when they were starting to rebuild their relationship, made her heart ache. She gazed out her window at the quiet street, watching as Miss Harris's car disappeared around the corner. The morning sun suddenly seemed less bright, and the comfortable silence of her home felt heavy with responsibility. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of the Rusty Nail, a dimly lit bar on the edge of town. Ella hesitated at the entrance, her hand resting on the weathered wooden door. The sound of pool balls clicking and country music drifted out onto the sidewalk. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The regulars turned to look at her, surprise evident on their faces. An elderly woman in a floral dress wasn't their usual customer. Through the haze of cigarette smoke, Ella spotted Trey at the far end of the bar, nursing what looked like a glass of whiskey. She walked over, her sensible shoes clicking against the wooden floor. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Trey looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. He gestured to the empty bar stool beside him. "What brings you here, Miss Williams?" Ella settled onto the stool, placing her purse on the counter. "We need to talk about Eli," she said, keeping her voice low. "I had a visit from social services this morning." The glass in Trey's hand froze halfway to his lips. He set it down slowly, his knuckles whitening around it. "Social services? They're concerned about Eli's living situation," Ella explained, watching his face carefully. "There have been complaints about neglect." Trey's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. "Neglect?" His voice was quiet, but there was an edge to it that made several nearby patrons shift uncomfortably. "I provide for my boy. He's got a roof over his head, food on the table." "I know you do," Ella interrupted gently. "But Eli needs more than just the basics, Trey. He needs his father." The biker's shoulders tensed, and for a moment, Ella could see the struggle playing out across his face. "I'm doing the best I can," he said, his voice rough. "I believe you are," Ella replied, her tone softening. "But your best right now might not be enough to keep him with you. The social worker, Miss Harris, she was very clear about that." Trey ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking tired. "What am I supposed to do? I can't just walk away from the life I've built." "Nobody's asking you to," Ella said. "But you need to make more time for Eli. He needs to know you're there for him, that you care about more than just providing the necessities." The afternoon light filtering through the dusty windows caught the silver in Trey's beard as he nodded slowly. "I never wanted him to feel alone," he admitted. "After his mother left, I didn't know how to be both mother and father to him." "You don't have to be both," Ella said. "You just need to be present. Be his father, Trey. That's all he wants." Trey picked up his glass again, staring into the amber liquid. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I'll do better. Whatever it takes, I'll make it right." "I know you will," Ella said, patting his arm gently. "And I'll help however I can." Trey turned to look at her, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that spoke of both gratitude and determination. "I appreciate that, Miss Williams, but this is my responsibility. I've got to step up, be the father he deserves." The promise hung between them in the smoky air of the bar, weighted with both hope and uncertainty. They both knew that changing years of established patterns wouldn't be easy, but at least now there was a chance. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Ella stepped into Martha's grocery store. The usual friendly chatter died down almost immediately. She could feel the stares boring into her back as she walked down the aisles, her shopping basket hanging heavy on her arm. "Did you hear?" A whispered voice carried across the produce section. "She's practically adopted that biker family." Ella picked up a tomato, examining it with more attention than necessary. Her hands trembled slightly, but she held her head high. Mrs. Peterson, who had been in her garden club for 20 years, deliberately turned down another aisle when she saw Ella approaching. The action stung more than Ella wanted to admit. At the checkout counter, young Tommy, who usually chatted with her about his college plans, barely met her eyes as he rang up her groceries. "That'll be $27.50, he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Outside the store, Ella nearly bumped into Rachel, her oldest friend in town. "Oh," Rachel said, stepping back quickly. I didn't see you there." "Rachel," Ella said softly, "would you like to have coffee this afternoon, like we usually do on Tuesdays?" Rachel clutched her purse tighter. "I'm sorry, Ella. I have other plans." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "You know, people are talking. They say you're putting yourself in danger, getting mixed up with those people." "Those people," Ella repeated, her voice steady despite the hurt blooming in her chest, "include a 13-year-old boy who needs help. But they're criminals, Ella. The whole town knows it. What about your reputation? What about everything you've built here?" A few passers-by slowed their pace, obviously eavesdropping. Ella noticed Mrs. Jenkins from the library pretending to window shop while clearly listening to every word. "My reputation?" Ella squared her shoulders. "My reputation should be that I help those who need it, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Rachel shook her head. "You're being stubborn. This isn't like helping at the food bank or organizing the church bake sale. These are dangerous people. Eli is a child," Ella said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "And Trey is a father trying to do better. That's all I need to know." "Well," Rachel stepped back, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I hope you know what you're doing, but don't expect the rest of us to stand by and watch you throw everything away." As Rachel walked away, Ella felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her. The whispers seemed to follow her down the street as she made her way home, her grocery bags feeling heavier with each step. The familiar faces that usually greeted her with warm smiles now turned away. The bakery owner who always saved her favorite sourdough bread suddenly became very busy with his display case. Even old Mr. Wilson, who had known her for 30 years, crossed the street to avoid passing her on the sidewalk. The isolation pressed in around her like a physical thing. Each avoided glance, each whispered comment, each former friend turning away, they all left their marks. Ella's steps slowed as she approached her house, and she felt tears threatening to spill. But then she remembered Eli's face when he talked about his drawings, the way his eyes lit up when she praised his talent. She thought of Trey's determined expression when he promised to do better for his son. The memory straightened her spine and lifted her chin. Let them talk, she thought. Let them whisper and judge. Some things were more important than being popular in town. Some things were worth standing alone for. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ella's front porch as she sat in her favorite rocking chair, a pitcher of fresh lemonade on the small table beside her. Eli slumped in the wooden chair next to her, his shoulders hunched, and his eyes fixed on the worn floorboards. His leather vest hung loosely on his thin frame, a constant reminder of the world he belonged to but didn't feel part of. "They called me gang trash today," Eli said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. His fingers traced the edge of his glass, leaving trails in the condensation. In front of everyone in the cafeteria, Ella's heart ached as she watched him struggle with the words. "That must have hurt something terrible," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Eli's voice cracked. "I just wish Dad was around more. He's always out with the club, always doing something else. When he is home, he hardly talks to me." He looked up at the ceiling, blinking rapidly. "Sometimes I think he'd rather I wasn't there at all." Ella leaned forward in her chair, her eyes fixed on the troubled boy beside her. "Your father loves you, Eli. He may not know how to show it, but he does. Then why doesn't he act like it?" Eli's voice rose slightly, pain evident in every word. "Why can't he just be normal? Why can't we be like other families?" A warm breeze rustled through the porch plants, carrying the sweet scent of Ella's flowering jasmine. She took a slow sip of her lemonade, choosing her words carefully. "You know, Eli, sometimes we get so caught up in what we think we're supposed to be, we forget who we really are." She set her glass down with a gentle clink. "Your father's choices don't have to be your choices." Eli turned to look at her, his eyes wide and uncertain. "But everyone expects me to be just like him. The club, the town, everyone." "Listen to me," Ella said, her voice carrying the weight of years of wisdom. "You're not just Trey Walker's son. You're Eli, a kind, thoughtful young man who deserves to choose his own path." She reached over and patted his hand. "I've seen how you draw in your notebook when you think no one's looking. I've noticed how gentle you are with the neighborhood cats. Those things are who you are, Eli, not what's stitched on that vest." Eli's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he sat up straighter in his chair. "But what if I disappoint him? What if I'm not strong enough to be what he wants?" "Real strength isn't about being tough or scary," Ella replied, her voice warm and reassuring. "Real strength is being true to yourself, even when it's hard, even when others don't understand." A small smile tugged at the corners of Eli's mouth, the first she'd seen all afternoon. He looked at her with newfound understanding, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "Thanks, Mrs. Williams," he said softly, standing up from his chair. "For everything, for listening, for seeing me." Ella watched as he gathered himself, noticing how his shoulders seemed less burdened than when he'd arrived. He paused at the top of the porch steps, turning back to face her. "You're the only one who really does, you know," he added quietly. "See me. I mean..." With that, he headed down the steps toward home, leaving Ella on her porch with an empty glass and a full heart. The morning sun cast long shadows through Ella's kitchen window as she stirred her tea, her mind still dwelling on yesterday's conversation with Eli. The sharp ring of her telephone cut through her thoughts, making her jump slightly. She picked up the receiver, her hand steady despite her racing heart. "Mrs. Williams?" Miss Harris's professional tone carried a note of urgency that made Ella's stomach tighten. "I need to discuss Eli Walker's situation with you." Ella lowered herself into her kitchen chair, clutching her tea mug for comfort. "Of course, Miss Harris. What seems to be the problem?" "We've received additional reports about Eli's home situation," Miss Harris said, her voice carrying the weight of bureaucratic authority. "There are concerns about his father's continued absence, and the environment he's being raised in isn't considered suitable for a child his age." Ella's grip tightened on her mug. "Trey is trying his best," she said, keeping her voice level despite her rising anxiety. "He's been making changes." "Mrs. Williams," Miss Harris interrupted. "I understand you've grown close to the family, but we have to consider what's best for Eli. The authorities are seriously considering removing him from Mr. Walker's care." The words hit Ella like a physical blow. She set her mug down with trembling hands, tea sloshing over the rim. "Surely there must be something that can be done. Trey loves his son. Love isn't always enough, Miss, Harris replied, her tone softening slightly. We need to see concrete changes, stable routines, regular meals, proper supervision. Mr. Walker's association with the Hells Angels is also a significant concern. Ella stood up, pacing her kitchen floor. But taking Eli away from his father, that would destroy them both. There has to be another solution. I'm afraid the situation has become urgent, Miss Harris continued. We'll be conducting a formal assessment next week. If significant improvements aren't evident, we'll have no choice but to act in Eli's best interest. The conversation continued with Miss Blaise, Harris listing requirements and expectations, each word feeling like another brick in a wall being built between Eli and his father. Ella listened, taking mental notes, her heart growing heavier with each passing moment. After hanging up the phone, Ella sank back into her chair, the morning sunshine now feeling mockingly cheerful. She had known things were serious, but this was beyond what she had imagined. The authorities weren't just making idle threats, they were preparing to tear apart a family. She glanced at her calendar hanging on the wall, the days until next week's assessment seeming to shrink before her eyes. The ticking of her kitchen clock seemed louder than usual, each second marking time slipping away from them. Her thoughts raced through possible solutions, but each one seemed to hit a dead end. Trey would need to make massive changes in a very short time, changes that might mean walking away from the only life he'd known for decades, and even then, would it be enough? Ella rubbed her temples, feeling the weight of helplessness settle over her shoulders. The situation was spiraling beyond her ability to control it. She had been so sure that with enough care and guidance she could help bridge the gap between Eli and Trey, help them build something better. Now, it seemed like their time was running out. The clock continued its relentless ticking, each sound a reminder of the decision looming over them all. Ella felt her chest tighten as she realized that despite all her efforts, despite all her care and intervention, she might not be able to stop what was coming. The morning sun cast long shadows through the town hall's windows as Ella sat in the waiting area outside Mayor Thompson's office. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, but her fingers wouldn't stop fidgeting with the edge of her cardigan. The tick-tock of the wall clock seemed to mock her growing anxiety. "Mrs. Williams?" The mayor's secretary called. "Mayor Thompson will see you now." Ella stood, smoothing her skirt, and walked into the office. Mayor Thompson, a man in his mid-50s with graying temples and kind eyes, gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Ella, it's good to see you," he said, though his expression was tinged with concern. "I understand you wanted to discuss young Eli Walker?" Ella nodded, settling into the chair. "Yes, Robert. I'm worried about what's going to happen to him. The social workers are circling, and I'm afraid they're going to take him away from his father." The mayor leaned back in his chair, letting out a heavy sigh. "I know you've taken quite an interest in the boy's welfare. Half the town's talking about it." "That's exactly why I'm here," Ella said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Everyone's so quick to judge, but nobody's stepping up to help. Eli's a good kid who needs support, not criticism." Mayor Thompson drummed his fingers on his desk. "The situation is complicated, Ella. The Hells Angels have brought their share of troubles to our town. Many people here have long memories." "But Eli isn't his father," Ella insisted, leaning forward. "He's just a child caught in the middle of all this." "I understand your position," the mayor said, his tone gentle but firm. "But the system has its own rules and procedures. If Trey Walker can't provide a stable home environment for his son, the authorities have to act." Ella's hands tightened in her lap. "And what about the community's responsibility? We're supposed to look out for each other. The town is sympathetic, Ella, but there's only so much we can do. If things don't improve quickly—" He trailed off, leaving the implications hanging in the air. "How much time?" Ella asked. her voice barely above a whisper. "From what I've heard, not much. The social workers are building their case. Unless there are significant changes in Eli's home situation, they'll have to follow protocol." Ella stood up, her shoulders straight, despite the weight she felt pressing down on them. "Then we need to do something now. Surely there must be programs, resources, something we can offer." The mayor spread his hands helplessly. "The system has its own timeline, its own requirements. I wish I could do more, but my hands are tied by regulations and procedures." "Rules and procedures," Ella echoed, shaking her head. "Sometimes I think we hide behind those words when we're afraid to do what's right." Mayor Thompson's expression softened. "You've always had a big heart, Ella. But this situation, it's bigger than just one person's good intentions." "Maybe that's the problem," Ella said, gathering her purse. "Everyone thinks it's too big to tackle, so nobody tries at all." She turned toward the door, her disappointment evident in every movement. The mayor called after her, "Ella, please be careful. Don't let your concern for the boy blind you to the realities of the situation." Ella paused with her hand on the doorknob. "The reality, Robert, is that a young boy needs help. Everything else is just noise." She walked out of the office, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. As she made her way down the town hall steps, she looked around at the familiar storefronts and faces of her neighbors. Some avoided her gaze, while others offered small, uncertain smiles. The weight of isolation settled around her shoulders as she realized how few people seemed willing to stand beside her in this fight. The town she'd known and loved all her life suddenly felt very different, very distant. The courthouse stood tall and imposing against the morning sky, its brick facade a stark reminder of the weight of law and order. Ella clutched her worn leather purse closer as she climbed the worn stone steps, her sensible shoes clicking against each step. The sound echoed in the nearly empty entrance hall. Inside, the air felt heavy with the scent of old papers and wood polish. Ella checked the directory, finding the office of Marcus Thompson, a family law attorney recommended by a friend. Her heart beat faster as she made her way down the long corridor. The lawyer's office was smaller than she expected, with walls lined with law books and certificates. Mr. Thompson, a middle-aged man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, gestured for her to take a seat in one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Mrs. Williams," he began, shuffling through some papers, "I understand you're here about the Walker case?" Ella nodded, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Yes. I'm concerned about Eli. He's just a boy who needs his father." Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "The situation is complicated, Mrs. Williams. Child Services has documented several instances of neglect. While there's no evidence of physical abuse, Trey Walker's association with the Hells Angels raises red flags with the authorities." "But he's trying," Ella protested, her voice rising slightly. "I've seen changes in both of them. Trey is making an effort to be there for his son." The lawyer sighed, removing his glasses to clean them with his tie. His tie. Unfortunately, the court doesn't always see these situations in shades of gray. They look at the facts. A single father with known criminal connections, multiple reports of the child being left alone, and poor school attendance. Ella felt her throat tighten. "What are the chances of Eli staying with his father?" "I need to be honest with you," Mr. Thompson said, replacing his glasses. "Unless there are significant changes in Mr. Walker's lifestyle and living arrangements, the court is likely to place Eli in foster care. It's standard procedure in cases like this." The words hit Ella like a physical blow. She thought about Eli's face, his quiet strength, and the way he was finally starting to open up. "There must be something we can do." The best course of action would be for Mr. Walker to demonstrate stability. That means steady employment, regular school attendance for Eli, and possibly— He paused, distancing himself from certain associations. Ella understood what he meant. Trey would need to leave the Hells Angels, something she knew would be nearly impossible for him. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The hearing is scheduled for next month. That's not much time to make substantial changes." Mr. Thompson handed her some papers. These outline the requirements for maintaining custody. Mr. Walker would need to meet all of them. Ella stood up, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders. She thanked the lawyer and turned to leave, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. As she opened the office door, she found herself face to face with Trey Walker himself. He was wearing his usual leather jacket, but his face showed signs of sleepless nights and worry. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, neither spoke. "I'm doing everything I can to keep my son," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Everything." The courthouse hallway fell silent as Miss Harris emerged from her office, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Trey stood up from the wooden bench, his leather vest creaking as he straightened to his full height. Ella watched from nearby, her heart racing as the social worker gestured for Trey to follow her inside. "Mr. Walker, please have a seat," Miss Harris said, settling behind her desk. The small office felt even smaller with Trey's imposing presence. Trey remained standing, his hands clenched at his sides. "I want to know why you're trying to take my boy away from me. Mr. Walker, please understand that we're only concerned about Eli's welfare." "Miss?" Harris's voice was calm but firm. "Our reports show that he's often left alone, sometimes for days at a time. His grades are suffering, and there have been multiple incidents at school. I'm doing the best I can." Trey's voice was rough with emotion. "I'm his father. Nobody has the right to take him from me. Being a father means more than just providing a roof over his head." "Miss," Harris replied, shuffling through some papers on her desk, "Eli needs stability, guidance, and consistent parental presence." Trey slammed his palm on the desk, making the nameplate rattle. "You don't know anything about us. You sit here in your office, looking down on people like me, thinking you know what's best. Mr. Walker, please calm down." "Miss," Harris didn't flinch, "this isn't helping your case." "My case?" Trey's laugh was bitter. "This isn't some court document you can file away. This is my son we're talking about." "Exactly, Miss." Harris leaned forward. "And as your son, Eli deserves better than what he's getting right now. We have documentation of nights when he's completely alone, of missed parent-teacher conferences, of concerning behavior patterns." Trey's face reddened. "I'm making changes. Ask Ella Williams. She's been helping us. Eli's doing better." "Mrs. Williams has spoken very highly of both you and Eli," Miss Harris acknowledged. "But good intentions aren't enough. We need to see concrete improvements in Eli's home situation." "Tell me what you want." Trey's voice cracked slightly. "Whatever it takes, I'll do it. Just don't take my boy." Miss Harris pulled out a document. "We can start with a structured parenting plan, regular check-ins, counseling sessions for both you and Eli, and documented proof of your presence at home during reasonable hours." Trey's jaw clenched. "You want me to jump through hoops like some trained dog?" "I want you to be a father," Miss Harris corrected him. "The kind of father Eli needs." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Trey paced the small office, his boots heavy on the floor. Finally, he turned back to Miss Harris. "Fine," he growled. "Whatever it takes. But I'm telling you right now, nobody's taking my son from me. Nobody." Miss Harris held his gaze. "Then prove it, Mr. Walker. Show us that you mean what you say." Trey grabbed the document off her desk, his hands shaking slightly. Without another word, he yanked the door open and stormed out. In the hallway, he nearly bumped into Ella, who had been waiting anxiously. He clutched the papers in his hand so tightly they crumpled. Ella could see the muscles in his jaw working as he fought to control himself. "I'm not losing him," Trey said, his voice rough with emotion. I don't care what I have to do. I'm not losing my boy." With that, he strode down the hallway, his footsteps echoing off the walls. His shoulders were set with new purpose, despite the visible tension in his frame. He pushed through the courthouse doors, leaving them swinging in his wake. The evening sun cast long shadows through Ella's living room windows as she sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of chamomile tea growing cold on the side table. Her hands worked methodically on her knitting, but her mind wandered to Eli and everything that had happened over the past weeks. The quiet of her house felt heavy tonight. Usually, she enjoyed these peaceful moments, but now they only reminded her of the growing distance between her and her old friends. She set down her knitting and picked up the thank you note Eli had written her after that first day in the town square. His awkward, teenage handwriting brought a sad smile to her face. "I've done everything I could," she whispered to herself, running her fingers over the creased paper. The memory of that scared boy, surrounded by bullies, seemed so long ago now. She'd watched him grow stronger, more confident in small ways, but would it be enough to keep him with his father? Ella stood up and walked to her kitchen window. Outside, the streetlights were coming on one by one. A few houses down, she could see the warm glow from Rachel's windows, remembering how her old friend had warned her about getting involved. The weight of isolation pressed against her chest. She thought about all the conversations she'd had, with the mayor, the social worker, the lawyer. Each one had left her feeling more helpless than the last. The system moved forward like a slow-moving train, unstoppable and indifferent to the complexities of human hearts. Moving to her refrigerator, she looked at the artwork Eli had given her last week, a rough sketch of her garden. He had talent, raw and untrained, but genuine. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd expect from a biker's son, and that was exactly the point she'd been trying to make to everyone. Eli was more than just Trey Walker's boy. The kitchen clock ticked steadily as Ella prepared herself a simple dinner. Toast and soup. She wasn't very hungry, but she knew she needed to eat. As she stirred the soup, she remembered how Eli's face had lit up when she'd taught him to make chocolate chip cookies. Such a simple thing, but it had meant the world to him. Maybe it wasn't enough, she said to the empty kitchen, but it was something real. She carried her bowl to the table, noticing how the house felt bigger, emptier than usual. The thought of Eli being taken away, placed in some strange home with people who didn't know him or understand his story, made her chest tight with worry. The phone's sharp ring cut through her thoughts, making her jump. At this hour, it couldn't be good news. Her heart quickened as she reached for the receiver. "Hello?" she answered, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Ella?" Trey's familiar rough voice came through the line. Something in his tone was different. Determined, almost fierce. "We're going to take a stand," he said firmly. "I won't let them take my boy." The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Ella pulled into the parking lot. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned off the ignition. The rumble of motorcycles filled the air, growing louder with each passing moment. One by one, the Hells Angels arrived, their chrome bikes gleaming in the early light. They parked in neat rows, their leather vests bearing patches that marked them as brothers. Trey stood at the center, his weathered face set with determination. "Thank you for coming," he said to Ella, his voice gruff but sincere. She noticed dark circles under his eyes, evidence of sleepless nights spent worrying about his son. Eli stood close to his father, wearing a clean button-down shirt instead of his usual leather vest. His eyes darted nervously between the gathering crowd of townspeople and the bikers who had come to support him. "Of course I'm here," Ella replied, reaching out to squeeze Eli's shoulder. "We're all here for you both." The courthouse doors opened, and Miss Harris emerged, clipboard in hand. She paused at the top of the steps, taking in the scene before her. The sight of dozens of bikers standing shoulder to shoulder made her eyes widen. Whispers rippled through the growing crowd of onlookers. Some townspeople kept their distance, watching from across the street. Others, including Rachel, Ella's old friend, stepped forward to stand with them. "I've never seen anything like this," Rachel murmured, linking her arm through Ella's. "Maybe we were wrong about them." Trey stepped forward, his boots heavy on the courthouse steps. "Miss Harris," he called out, his voice carrying across the quiet morning air. "These men are my brothers. They're here to show you that Eli has a family. A strong one." One by one, the bikers removed their helmets. They stood tall, proud, and respectful. There was no menace in their stance, only solidarity. "My son," Trey continued, his voice catching slightly, "deserves to stay with his father. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm changing, thanks to people like Ella who showed me it's never too late." Ella felt tears prick at her eyes as she watched Trey place his hand on Eli's shoulder. The boy looked up at his father, hope shining in his eyes. Miss Harris descended the steps slowly, her heels clicking against the concrete. She stopped in front of Trey and Eli, her expression thoughtful. "This is unexpected," she admitted, looking around at the gathered crowd. The mayor appeared at the courthouse doors, drawn by the commotion. He surveyed the scene, his eyebrows raised in surprise at the peaceful assembly. "We're here to support one of our own," a gruff biker spoke up. "The kid needs his dad, and Trey's doing right by him now." The tension in the air was thick as they waited. Miss Harris consulted her clipboard, then looked at Eli. "How do you feel about all this?" she asked him quietly. Eli straightened his shoulders, finding courage in the support around him. "I want to stay with my dad," he said clearly. "He's trying really hard, and I have people who care about me, like Ella and all my dad's friends." The morning sun climbed higher as they stood there, united in their purpose. The usual divide between town and bikers seemed to blur, if only for this moment. Ella felt Rachel squeeze her arm, a silent acknowledgement that sometimes the most unlikely alliances could form in the name of love and family. They all waited, hearts pounding, for the decision that would change everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as dozens of Hell's Angels members stood shoulder to shoulder, their leather vests gleaming. The rumble of motorcycles had announced their arrival, drawing curious onlookers from nearby shops and offices. Ella stood next to Trey, her hand resting gently on his arm as they waited for the proceedings to begin. Miss Harris emerged from her car, clutching her briefcase tightly. Her steps faltered slightly at the sight of so many bikers, but she maintained her professional composure. The mayor and several town officials watched from the courthouse entrance, their expressions a mix of concern and surprise. Inside the meeting room, tension filled the air. Eli sat between his father and Ella, his shoulders hunched under the weight of uncertainty. The social worker settled into her chair, arranging her papers with methodical precision. "Mr. Walker," Miss Harris began, her voice steady, "we're here to discuss Eli's living situation and determine what's best for his future." Trey stood up slowly, his usual intimidating presence softened by vulnerability. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn photograph. "This is Eli when he was 5, he said, his voice rough with emotion. "His mother had just left us, and I promised myself I'd never let him down." The room fell silent as Trey continued. "I know I haven't been the father he deserves. I've made mistakes, too many to count, but my son—" He paused, swallowing hard. "My son is everything to me." Ella watched as several of the bikers shifted in their seats, some wiping at their eyes. These tough men, usually so stoic, were moved by their leader's raw honesty. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes," Trey declared, looking directly at Miss Harris. "Counseling, parenting classes, regular check-ins, anything. Just please, don't take my boy away." Eli reached for his father's hand, tears streaming down his face. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Miss Harris, who watched the interaction with careful consideration. "And you have support?" she asked, looking around the room at the assembled bikers. One of the older members stood up. "We're family, ma'am. We look after our own, and we'll make sure both Trey and Eli get whatever help they need." Ella stepped forward then, her voice clear and strong. "I'll continue working with them both. These past weeks have shown me there's so much love between father and son. They just need guidance to express it better." Miss Harris studied her notes, then looked at the determined faces before her. The bikers' presence, rather than intimidating, demonstrated a community's commitment to one of their own. She saw not criminals, but people willing to stand up for a father and son who needed help. After what felt like an eternity, Miss Harris closed her file. "Mr. Walker," she began, "I can see that you're serious about making changes. I'm willing to recommend that Eli remain in your custody, under certain conditions." The tension in the room broke like a wave. Trey's shoulders sagged with relief as Eli threw his arms around his father's waist. "You'll need to attend family counseling sessions, both of you," Miss Harris continued. "We'll set up regular check-ins, and I expect to see consistent improvement in your home situation." Trey nodded solemnly, still holding his son close. "Whatever it takes," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. The bikers exchanged quiet looks of triumph, while Ella dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Miss Harris gathered her papers, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth as she watched father and son embrace. The late afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Ella's heart was still racing from the intensity of the hearing, but a wave of relief washed over her as she watched Trey embrace Eli. The social worker's decision to let them stay together, with conditions, felt like a miracle. Trey's fellow bikers were filing out of the courthouse, their leather vests catching the sunlight. Their usual intimidating presence had softened, replaced by genuine smiles and quiet celebration. They patted Trey on the back as they passed, each gesture a silent acknowledgement of their shared victory. "I can't believe it," Trey said, his voice thick with emotion. His weathered face showed signs of the stress he'd been carrying, but his eyes were bright. "I really thought they were going to take him away." Ella placed a gentle hand on his arm. "You showed them what matters most, that you love your son and you're willing to fight for him. That means everything." They watched as Eli chatted with Miss Harris, who was explaining the details of the family counseling program. The boy seemed different already, standing a little taller, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "I don't know how to thank you," Trey said, turning to Ella. "You stood by us when nobody else would. You saw something in us that even we couldn't see." "I saw a family worth fighting for," Ella replied simply. She smoothed her dress, still somewhat amazed at finding herself in the middle of this unlikely alliance between a grandmother and a group of bikers. The courthouse was nearly empty now, their voices echoing in the grand space. Eli joined them, his face split by a wide grin. "Dad, Miss Harris says we can start counseling next week, and she thinks maybe I could join an art program too." Trey squeezed his son's shoulder. "Whatever you want, kid. We're going to do this right." 8. They made their way outside, where the late afternoon had turned golden. The motorcycles were lined up along the curb, gleaming in the sun. A few curious onlookers still lingered, watching the unusual group. Ella found a quiet bench near the courthouse steps, and Trey joined her, while Eli talked excitedly with some of the remaining bikers. The moment felt surreal. The tough biker and the grandmother sitting together after winning such an important battle. "You know," Trey said quietly, "this is just the beginning. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." Ella nodded, watching a pair of pigeons pecking at crumbs near their feet. "Yes, but you're not alone anymore. Sometimes it takes a village. Even if that village includes a bunch of bikers and one stubborn old lady." Trey chuckled. the sound warm and genuine. "I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for that day you stepped in to help Eli. It changed everything." The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the courthouse steps. In the distance, they could hear the normal sounds of town life continuing. Cars passing, people talking, the world moving on. But here, in this moment, time seemed to stand still. "Thank you," Trey said again, his voice barely above a whisper, "for believing in us." Ella smiled, watching Eli laugh at something one of the bikers had said. The boy's face was bright with hope, and that was worth every bit of gossip, every disapproving look, every moment of doubt she'd experienced along the way. They sat together in comfortable silence, two unlikely allies united by their love for one boy, both knowing that while this battle was won, their journey was far from over. But for now, in this moment, it was enough to simply be grateful for the victory they'd achieved together. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ella's front yard as she watched Eli helping his father work on a motorcycle. The boy's confidence had grown remarkably over the past few weeks, and it showed in everything he did, from the way he carried himself to how he spoke to others. "Hand me that wrench, son," Trey called out, and Eli quickly found the right tool, explaining the differences between socket sizes as he passed it over. His father nodded approvingly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Ella sat in her usual spot on the porch, a glass of sweet tea beside her, marveling at the change in the young boy she'd first met in the town square. Gone was the hunched shoulders and downcast eyes. In their place was a young man who stood tall, who smiled more freely, and who had begun to find his own path. The mandatory counseling sessions had done wonders for both father and son. Twice a week, they'd drive to the next town over to meet with Dr. Martinez. And though neither of them talked much about what went on in those sessions, the results spoke for themselves. "Did you see my art project got picked for the school display?" Eli called out to Ella, wiping his hands on a shop rag. His eyes sparkled with pride as he mentioned his recent achievement. "I certainly did," Ella responded, her heart warming at the memory of seeing his painting prominently displayed in the school hallway during last week's parent-teacher conference. That sunset over the mountains was absolutely beautiful. Trey stood up from his work, placing a hand on Eli's shoulder. "Got your mother's talent? That's for sure," he said softly. And for once, the mention of Eli's mother didn't bring that familiar shadow of pain to either of their faces. Even the town's attitude had begun to shift. Just yesterday, Eli had been invited to join the school's art club, and several of his former tormentors had actually apologized for their past behavior. The boy who had once hidden behind his father's reputation was now creating his own identity. "Hey, Miss Williams," Eli called out as he jogged up to her porch. "Would you like to come to the art show next Friday? They're displaying 3 of my paintings." Ella beamed at him. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, sweetheart." Trey walked up behind his son, cleaning his hands with a shop rag. "Maybe we could all grab dinner afterward?" he suggested, and Eli's face lit up at the idea. The transformation wasn't just in Eli's demeanor, it was in the little things, too. His grades had improved significantly. He'd started wearing colors other than black. He'd even begun teaching some of the younger neighborhood kids how to draw during weekend afternoons in the park. The local library had asked him to paint a mural for the children's section, and Eli had thrown himself into the project with enthusiasm. His design, featuring characters from classic children's books, had won over even the most skeptical members of the library board. As Ella watched father and son return to their work on the motorcycle, she noticed how they moved in sync now, anticipating each other's needs, sharing quiet jokes, and working together as a team. The distance that had once existed between them had slowly but surely closed. From her vantage point on the porch, Ella could see how far they'd all come. The scared boy who had once been surrounded by bullies was now standing tall, proud of who he was becoming. His father had learned to be present, to show his love not just through protection but through active participation in his son's life. Ella picked up her glass of sweet tea, a content smile spreading across her face as she watched Eli confidently explain something to his father, gesturing animatedly. Pride swelled in her heart, knowing she had played a small part in helping this young man find his way. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fresh coffee and baked goods from Mary's diner as Ella made her way down Main Street. She noticed something different in the air today. Not just the weather, but the atmosphere itself had shifted. Where there had once been tension, there was now a gentle acceptance taking root. Outside the diner, she spotted Mr. Granger, the same man who had warned her about the bikers months ago, sharing a table with two Hells Angels members. Their leather vests gleamed in the morning sun as they laughed over steaming cups of coffee. The sight made Ella pause, a warm smile spreading across her face. "Morning, Ella," Mr. Granger called out, waving her over. "Join us?" As she approached, she recognized the bikers as Mike and Pete, two of Trey's closest friends. "We were just telling Mr. Granger here about the motorcycle safety course we're planning for the high school," Mike explained, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. "It's actually a good idea, Mr. Granger admitted, shaking his head with a chuckle. "Who would have thought?" Inside the diner, Rachel, her old friend who had once cautioned her about getting involved, was serving coffee to a mixed group of townspeople and bikers. The scene was so natural, so peaceful, it brought tears to Ella's eyes. "You did this, you know," a voice said beside her. She turned to find Miss Harris, the social worker, standing there with a knowing look. "You showed everyone that labels don't define people." The change hadn't happened overnight. It had started small, with Trey and the other bikers showing up for community events, helping with local fundraisers, and proving through actions rather than words that they were more than their reputation suggested. The townspeople, in turn, had slowly begun to let go of their prejudices. Later that afternoon, Ella watched from her favorite spot on the porch as a group of children rode their bikes past her house. Among them was Eli, no longer the scared boy she'd first met in the town square. He rode confidently, laughing with his friends, some of whom had once been his bullies. Mrs. Peterson from the library walked by, carrying a heavy box of books. Two bikers immediately crossed the street to help her, and she thanked them with the same warmth she showed everyone else. The scene would have been unthinkable just months ago. The local coffee shop had even started reserving a table for what they called the Sunday morning crew, a mixture of bikers and elderly townspeople who gathered to play chess and share stories. The unlikely friendship had become one of the town's favorite topics of conversation. From her vantage point, Ella could see the town square where it had all begun. The place where she'd first stood up for Eli now hosted regular community gatherings where leather-clad bikers mingled easily with business owners and families. A group of Hells Angels motorcycles rumbled past, their riders exchanging friendly waves with pedestrians. Some of the shopkeepers stepped outside to greet them, and Ella watched as Trey pulled up to park his bike. He was headed to the ice cream parlor, where he had become a regular, often bringing treats for the local kids. The sound of laughter drew her attention to the park across the street. There, townsfolk and bikers had gathered for an impromptu barbecue, sharing food and stories as if they'd been friends for years. Children played nearby, completely at ease with both groups of adults. Ella settled into her porch chair, watching the scene unfold before her. The tension that had once divided their small town had transformed into something beautiful, a community united despite its differences. As she observed the bikers and townsfolk mingling peacefully, a contented smile spread across her face. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of the Family Counseling Center as Trey Walker sat in his motorcycle, his hands gripping the handlebars a little too tightly. He'd traded his usual leather vest for a plain black jacket, but his tension was visible in every line of his body. Inside the waiting room, Eli slouched in a chair, his eyes fixed on his sneakers. The silence between father and son felt heavy, loaded with years of unsaid words. A few other patients gave them sideways glances, clearly recognizing the infamous Hell's Angels leader and his son. Mr. Walker? The counselor, Dr. Sarah Chen, appeared in the doorway with a gentle smile. You and Eli can come in now. Trey's boots seemed to echo against the floor as he followed his son into the office. The room was warm and inviting, with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. Still, Trey looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. So, Doctor, Chen began, tell me what brings you here today. Trey cleared his throat. Been told I need to work on communicating. The words came out rough, like gravel. With my boy here. Eli shifted in his seat, stealing a glance at his father. Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. Eli, how do you feel about that? I guess. Eli's voice was quiet. I mean, we don't really talk much. About anything. The session progressed slowly at first, with halting responses and long pauses, but as time went on, something began to change. Trey started opening up about his own father, a man who'd never shown him affection or approval. Never wanted to be like him, Trey admitted, his voice thick with emotion. Guess I ended up doing the same thing to you, kid. Eli looked up, surprised by his father's vulnerability. Dad, I see you drawing sometimes, Trey continued. In your room. Never said anything 'cause, well, didn't know what to say. But you're good. Really good. Color rose in Eli's cheeks. You've seen my drawings? Yeah. That one you did, of the sunset over the mountains? Reminded me of when I used to take long rides out there. Before. He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at his biker jacket hanging on the chair. Dr. Chen smiled warmly. That's wonderful, Trey. Noticing and acknowledging your son's talents is very important. Later that afternoon, father and son sat on their front porch. The neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of wind chimes from Ella's house. Eli had brought out his sketchbook, something he'd never done before in front of his father. This is what I've been working on lately, he said softly, turning to a page with a detailed drawing of a motorcycle. His father's motorcycle. Trey took the sketchbook carefully, his weathered hands gentle with the pages. You got every detail right, he said, his voice filled with wonder. Even got the scratch on the gas tank from that time in Denver. You never told me about Denver, Eli said, looking at his father with newfound curiosity. Trey was quiet for a moment, then shifted in his chair to face his son. Well, it was back in '95. Me and a couple of the guys were riding through Colorado. He paused, then added, maybe we could take a ride out there sometime. Just you and me, if you want. Really? Eli's face lit up with a smile that made him look younger, more carefree. Really? Trey reached out and, after a moment's hesitation, put his hand on Eli's shoulder. The touch was awkward but sincere, a bridge being built between their two worlds. They sat there together, looking out at the street where they'd lived as strangers for so long, now feeling more like family than they had in years. The silence between them was different now. Comfortable, full of possibility, rather than regret. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Ella's front porch as she settled into her favorite wicker chair. The gentle spring breeze carried the sweet scent of her blooming gardenias, making her smile. What a difference a few months could make. On her lawn, an unusual gathering had formed. Members of the Hell's Angels, their leather vests gleaming in the sunlight, stood chatting with townspeople they'd once avoided. The tension that had divided their small community for so long had begun to melt away, replaced by something new and unexpected. Understanding. Mrs. Henderson, who had once crossed the street at the sight of any biker, was now sharing her famous lemon squares with two leather-clad men. They laughed at something she said, their deep chuckles, mixing with the cheerful conversations around them. Trey stood near the garden, deep in conversation with the mayor. His posture was different now, less defensive, more open. The counseling sessions had worked wonders, not just for his relationship with Eli, but for how he carried himself in the world. He caught Ella's eye and gave her a small nod of appreciation. Rachel, Ella's old friend who had once warned her about getting involved with the bikers, sat beside her on the porch. "I was wrong about them," she admitted, watching the scene before them. "And I was wrong about you, Ella. You saw something in them that the rest of us couldn't or wouldn't see." Ella patted her friend's hand. "Sometimes people just need someone to believe in them," she said softly. "That's all I did." Miss Harris, the social worker, had joined the gathering too. She stood chatting with some of the townspeople, her initial skepticism replaced by genuine warmth. The system hadn't failed Eli after all. It had adapted, grown, and helped create something beautiful. The sound of children's laughter drew Ella's attention to the sidewalk, where several kids played. Among them was Eli, no longer the scared, withdrawn boy she'd first met in the town square. He moved with confidence now, his shoulders straight, his smile genuine. The other kids treated him like any other teenager. No more whispers, no more fear, no more isolation. Some of the bikers had brought their families, and their children played alongside the town kids. The barriers that had once seemed so insurmountable now appeared ridiculous in hindsight. They were all just people, trying their best to build better lives. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the gathering, Eli excused himself from his friends and started walking down the street toward home. Ella watched him go, her heart full. His walk was different now, steady, assured, hopeful. The weight of his father's reputation no longer seemed to bow his shoulders. Instead, he moved like someone who knew his place in the world and was comfortable in it. Ella felt tears prick at her corners of her eyes, but they were happy tears. She thought about that first day in the town square, how scared she'd been to step in, how uncertain of the consequences, but that one small act of kindness had rippled outward, touching not just Eli's life, but the entire community. The chatter and laughter around her porch continued as Eli's figure grew smaller in the distance. He turned once to wave, and Ella lifted her hand in response, her heart swelling with pride and joy. This was what community looked like. Not perfect, not without its challenges, but united in its desire to help each other grow and thrive.